Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us on Zoom this evening as we welcome distinguished professor and historian and author Jelani Cobb to the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education, and at least to West Virginia, if only virtually for now. It is a real pleasure to see all of you here tonight. My name is Jody Brummage. I am Director of Education and Outreach here at the center. And before we turn things over to tonight's speaker, there are some acknowledgments that we certainly want to make. First and foremost, to friend of the Byrd Center, Mark Kohut, who has been instrumental in not only getting us connected with Jelani and making this connection for us, but then also doing so much work spreading the word. And I think a lot of you tonight probably are here because Mark reached out to you in one way or another. So we thank you, Mark, so much for your contributions this evening. I also want to thank Four Seasons Bookstore here in Shepherdstown, our partners in all of our great book talks here at the center. We really appreciate having such a great little bookstore right here in town that we can work with as we bring such distinguished authors and writers to Shepherdstown. Tonight's program is going to be a wonderful addition to a growing resource of events that we've held over the last almost 2 years now, focusing on the history of Congress and policy towards civil rights in the United States. And if you're interested in seeing more of these types of programs, I would encourage you to visit byrdcenter.org and look up the page Of, By, and For All People. That's Of, By, and For All People. That's where you can access all of the past programs and eventually tonight's program to view at any time. They'll also be available on the Byrd Center's YouTube channel, which is can be found by searching our name in YouTube. And these programs are made possible through the ongoing support of the Friends of the Byrd Center. I already mentioned one friend tonight, Mark Kohut, but the Friends of the Byrd Center is a growing and dynamic group of supporters, volunteers, and community partners who are essential in our work of advancing representative democracy here at the Byrd Center. And if you are joining us tonight for the first time, I would encourage you to visit us at byrdcenter.org/support us. That's where you can learn more about what the Byrd Center is, the types of programs and initiatives that we do, and maybe become a friend and supporter yourself. And we would certainly appreciate having you along in the valuable work that we do here at the center. So with that, I will see you again after the book talk section tonight to take your questions and deliver them to Jelani Cobb. But first, our interim director here at the Byrd Center, Dr. Ray Smock, is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Jody, and we'll look forward to seeing you back at the Q&A session part of the program. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce tonight's speaker. Jelani Cobb is the Ira A. Lippman Professor of Journalism at Columbia University and former Associate Professor of African American History and Director of the Institute for African American Studies at the University of Connecticut at Storrs. He's a graduate of Howard University and has his PhD from Rutgers. He he's also received fellowships from the Ford and Fulbright Foundations. And since 2015, he's been a staff writer for the New Yorker. Many of you probably know him from his pieces in the New Yorker going back to, I think, about 2012. And he is simply one of the most sought after public speakers, TV commentators, and one of this nation's outstanding public intellectuals. And we're so honored to have him with us tonight. He is the author of The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, and To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip hop aesthetic. He is the editor of the Essential Harold Cruz Reader, and with David Remnick, author of The Matter of Black Lives, which is a fascinating compilation of outstanding writing from Joe Lepore to Toni Morrison to James Baldwin. and many others on the Black experience, a fascinating new book. But first and foremost, tonight, the presentation is because of his editing of a remarkable new edition, a timely book of, if there ever was one, the Essential Kerner Commission Report, which he has edited for a new generation of readers and activists. At the time it was published, it was one of the most important, government documents, important studies ever done, and you're going to hear more of that from Professor Cobb. So I applaud him for making this work available for another generation of readers and people who need to be informed of this, who perhaps were not alive in 1968. And I also applaud Liverwright, the publisher, a division of Norton, for their publishing this as a major contribution to our current discourse. So before I turn it over to Professor Cobb, just a personal observation, and one of the reasons I'm so excited about tonight. In 1968, when the Kerner Commission, the original Kerner Commission report was published, I was a teaching assistant in the first class in African-American history taught at the University of Maryland. And in those at that time, we were amazed that this remarkable commission did its work and published its findings, only to see a government report sell hundreds of thousands of copies in a matter of weeks. And it was a truly phenomenal experience, and a major part of the dialogue that was going on in the 60s during the civil rights era, a time of great promise, and also of riots and civil disorder and assassinations and all the terrible things that we sometimes associate with that time. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Jelani Cobb.
So thank you, Ray, for the introduction. And I'm very excited to be able to talk with you all virtually. Some people may have heard earlier that I was saying that, alas, West Virginia is, I think, one of 5 or maybe 6 states that I have yet to visit. And so this just gives you all a great excuse to invite me down there in person when that can happen. So this is a kind of interesting project in that there's a question of, why. One of the first questions I get is, why did we put this book out, and what makes it important now? And as a professor and someone who is a historian and has often long taught American history, there's a kind of conflation effect of the 1960s, because it's such a significant point in American history, and so many things happen that they kind of all blend together into this general climate of tumult for younger people, that is, the people who weren't alive. My favorite indicator of this is that a student came up to me once after I'd done a civil rights history lecture, and very kind of meekly was standing around, and it was obvious that she had a question that she wanted to ask, and she was a little nervous about raising it. So eventually I kind of come over to her and say, is there something that you wanted to ask me? And she says, yes. Were you involved in the civil rights movement? And so I said, excuse me? And she said, were you active in the civil rights movement? And I said, yes, in fact, I was. I organized a 9-month sit-in my mother's belly. And so she had just kind of conflated the idea of this whole era and kind of the accordion effect of things. And history has an interesting way of unwinding itself, of its pertinence being made obvious to us or apparent to us through current affairs. And that's indeed the case with the Kerner Commission and the Kerner Report. And so, given the particulars of this format, what I would typically do is, read. What I'm going to do is talk a bit, read a little bit, then talk some more, and then I'll conclude, reading a little bit from the introduction. And so on May 25th of last year, Memorial Day, we witnessed a spectacle that was staggering in its brutality and immense in its implications. We saw an excruciating 8-minute, 46-second video in which a man's life was extinguished. The man was named George Perry Floyd. He died under the knee of police officer Derek Chauvin of the Minneapolis PD. Over the course of this nearly 9-minute ordeal, as it was later revealed in the court proceedings, the actual incident unfolded over 9 minutes and 29 seconds. But over the course of this ordeal, we witnessed Mr. Floyd, who was handcuffed at the time, beg, plead for his life, and then having abandoned the hope that any justice or any relief would be coming from mortal sources, began to invoke the spirit of his deceased mother for otherworldly intervention. To no avail, Mr. Floyd died before our eyes. For someone like me, who has covered police and policing as a journalist, and who has written and taught about African-American history, with the theme of policing being very prominent in the discussion, I was familiar with the circumstances under which George Floyd died. But it was also apparent that a large portion of the country was completely unaware of the fact that we lived in a place where something like this could happen. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, the video began ricocheting around social media, being texted to people, emailed to people. It became a kind of collective moment in which people could identify where they were when this video made its way into their lives. I personally resisted watching the video and did not watch it for several months until work required me to be able to speak about what had actually happened. And so this shock of awakening sent people on a journey into history and into scholarship and into the work that had been done around the questions. How did we get here? Everyone wanted to know. How could something like this happen? And the answers to those questions had been shockingly apparent, notably apparent, for many, many years. And so in order to best understand why we did the Kerner Commission report, I'll walk a little bit through history in the 20th century. In the early portion of the 20th century, where African Americans were overwhelmingly still relegated to the South, places where the states where many of their ancestors had been enslaved, a tide of immigrant labor was pouring into the country, meeting the needs of the burgeoning industrial powers of the American cities, particularly in the North. The onset of World War I closed the spigot of immigration, and at the same time created an incredible demand for labor, industrial demand for labor, which was filled increasingly by African Americans who began migrating to the North in large numbers. And not simply to the North, but often to the Midwest and to the West, but specifically to industrial centers. And we can kind of find out now. I do this game with people when I talk with them. If I meet people in Chicago, then I know that their relatives likely came from Mississippi. When I talk with Black people in Los Angeles, I often ask where in Texas or Louisiana did their ancestors come from. Personally, I grew up in Queens, New York. My parents met in Harlem and then moved to Queens to raise their family. And my father, true to the kind of narrative that we know about New York came from Georgia. People overwhelmingly in New York came from Georgia, Virginia, and North Carolina. My mother came from Alabama, and the population of Alabama, by and large, went to Detroit and Chicago. As a quick aside, my mother went to Chicago to finish high school, and she migrated. Most people would migrate when they were 18 or so. My mother left before that, and finished high school in Chicago. And she was very thin, and she described turning a corner one day on the south side of Chicago and the wind literally blowing her off her feet. And she decided that that was as much Chicago as she wanted to have in her life. So she quit Chicago and came to New York City. And so I've often told people that I owe my entire existence to a gust of wind on the south side of Chicago on one particular day. But nonetheless, these populations moved into cities, and you began to see a kind of nationalization of Southern racial concerns. There had always been Black populations in the North, but the increasing numbers of people in the North, brought about a almost allergic reaction among white Northerners to the influx of migrants. And police and policing became central to this. And if you go back in time, you can find records, people are saying that police are really being deployed in order to make sure that the Black people stay where they are relegated to in the cities, and that they don't make their presence known in other parts of the city. It's not coincidental that we begin to see a spate of race riots that begin in the early part of the 20th century. We're seeing the centennial of these events now. In May, we just saw the centennial of the Tulsa riot. 2 years ago, there was the centennial of the Washington, D.C. race riot and the Chicago race riot. In 2017, there was the centennial of the East St. Louis race riot. And so there were these circumstances that overwhelmingly occurred in urban environments as a kind of reaction to the presence of Black people. In 1935 in Harlem, there's an incident in which a young Puerto Rican young man is arrested in a store, allegedly for shoplifting, and beaten before the other shoppers and onlookers. And the sight of the police officers physically using physical force against a 15-year-old boy sparked a riot in the city and across Harlem. And then in 1943, a Black soldier who was home from the war on leave in uniform is beaten. A police officer speaks, according to the report, speaks disrespectfully to his mother. He comes to his mother's defense. The police officer strikes him. The sight of a police officer beating a soldier in uniform sparks a race riot in 1943. A similar incident happened in Detroit in 1943, which was investigated by a young attorney by the name of Thurgood Marshall. We could kind of walk through this history and see, in 1965, this happens in Watts, California, notably. In 1967, it happens in Detroit and Newark. In 1966, it happens in Cincinnati. I'm leaving out many places and many other incidents as a consequence of this. And what tended to happen in these moments was that people would, leaders, heads of municipal government and so on would commission a study. When this happened, it was like, we want to understand how this happened, what the cause of it was. And so we need a study that will get to the bottom of this. And the report in 1935 and the report in 1943, the report in 1965 that comes out of Watts, the McCone report, they tend to have a certain shared DNA. They talk about the police incident being not the sum total of the causation for these uprisings, and that they really reflect a broader palette of discriminatory practices. And these observations are kind of disparate until the mid-1960s, When the uprising in Watts happens, which happens in August of 1965, it comes just 5 days after Lyndon B. Johnson has signed one of the most momentous pieces and significant pieces of legislation in the 20th century, the Voting Rights Act, which, as you can see, is a matter we're still fighting over, 50 plus years later. And so when he signs the Voting Rights Act, it's hailed as this tremendous marker of racial progress in the United States. 5 days later, the city of Watts explodes into the worst urban rioting the country has ever seen. The fact that Lyndon B. Johnson has signed both the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act and has launched a war on poverty set of programs, we can see the outlines and contours of what we would make to be a progressive presidency in terms of civil rights. Yet everywhere, the presidency, the administration seems to be outpaced by the tide of anger and the conditions that are festering and boiling over in American cities. And it is after two other incidents, both related to police use of force in Detroit and in Newark, which happened about 10 days apart in 1967, that President Lyndon B. Johnson pulls together a commission to examine the causes of what they call, in rather bureaucratic, sanitized language, civil disturbances or civil disorders. And the commission is charged with finding out three things: what happened, why did it happen, and what can be done to prevent it from happening again. It was a truly bipartisan undertaking. It featured, there were 11 members of the commission. There were Republicans, there were Democrats, there were figures from municipal government, notably the mayor of New York City, John Lindsay, participated, Senator Fred Harris, Senator Edward Brooke, who was then the only African-American in the Senate and the first Black person elected to the Senate since Reconstruction, Roy Wilkins, who was then the chair of the NAACP. It was chaired by Otto Kerner, who was the Democratic governor of Illinois. And so this commission, which we kind of think of now as government commissions as being rubber stamps, that you appoint a commission when you don't want to do anything. But this commission took its charge seriously, and they set to work in the summer of 1967, getting to find what exactly happened. They held hearings. They brought people to testify before Congress. They went out on fact-finding missions. They divided themselves into pairs and went out across the country talking to people about what had happened and why it had happened and what was going on in the conditions of American cities. A practice that proved to be revelatory for many of them. When I spoke with Senator Fred Harris, who is the last living member of the commission, was 90 years old. I think he may be 91 now. And he said he was stunned to visit Cincinnati and see neighborhoods where there were just mounds and mounds of garbage and infested with rats because the municipal services had failed so badly. And this gave people insight into what happened. And over the course of the fall and winter and into the spring, they continued this work and produced the Kerner Commission Report, which was actually the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, but more commonly known as the Kerner Commission Report. And the findings were astounding. You could find the threads of some of the previous reports there, but it meant something entirely different, of a magnitude of difference actually, for people with the ear of the president to say, in fact, there was no Negro problem in the United States, that it was a white problem in the United States. And that the problems that we saw that culminated in the riots in American cities were the product of institutionalized white racism. They say that the police are only a spark, and not simply the problem, but the problems lie in housing, in education, in the lack of quality education, in healthcare, the lack of access to quality healthcare, to unemployment and underemployment, to a generalized frustration with the discriminatory policies that kept people locked into cyclical debt and deprived them of the ability to move into a higher socioeconomic position in the way that other previous generations of American city dwellers had been able to do. This report was not well received, to say the least. Lyndon B. Johnson, who suspected that there was some form of communist agitation at play in these uprisings, was not at all amenable to the idea that he had appointed a commission which was going to say in an election year that the problems of Black America could be placed squarely at the doorstep of white America. It was a kind of politically radioactive decision. And so the report was shelved. There were essentially two reactions to the report. The official one, in which it was shelved, and Lyndon Johnson refused to even meet with his commission to discuss its findings. And then the public reaction, because the commission had wisely chosen to have the book published by a trade publisher at the same time that, or just after, it was delivered to the president. And that proved to be one of the most significant decisions in the history of the Kerner Commission. The book became a bestseller. Hundreds of thousands of copies were flying off shelves. It was delivered in March of 1968. People were deeply interested in the questions that it raised and the questions it tried to grapple with. And then a month later, Martin Luther King was killed. And hundreds of American cities went up in flames. And the report went from being a sober assessment of the American past and how it had led to a present crisis, to having an almost prognostication quality to it, which is where its history and significance remains. So we could have revisited Kerner in 1980 after Miami police beat a man by the name of Arthur McDuffie to death and tried to stage his death to look like a motorcycle accident. After the police officers were acquitted of this, despite the testimony of one of their fellow officers who confessed that there was no motorcycle accident, that they had beaten him to death. When he was acquitted, 5 days of rioting just wreaked havoc in the city. We could have revisited this in 1992 when we saw the uprisings in Los Angeles as a result of Rodney King's beating and death. Not death, excuse me, his beating. We could have revisited this in 2014 after the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And finally, in the aftermath of George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor's death, we began to have conversations saying that it was time to revisit Kerner and to look at what the significance of this report was in 1968 and how much of that significance lingers in 2020 and 2021 and beyond. I know I said I was going to do some reading, but I won't do some reading right now. Maybe I can do that before we wrap up. But I want to jump in to have some time to get into questions, and then maybe I'll read in between.
Well, thank you so much for bringing us to this place. And I would encourage everyone in the chat to feel free to enter some questions. And one question that I did see arise as you were talking about some of the steps that the Kerner Commission went through in the preparation of the report, what were some of the actual findings that they made? How did they arrive at those findings through their visits or their testimony? What were some of the sort of the high points of that process?
Sure. So they said things like that there needed to be 2 million jobs created immediately, that there needed to be 6 million new housing units created in the country, that there needed to be a revision of the welfare system that actually allowed people to have to live at above the poverty level. They said that media needed to be revamped, that media needed to be diversified, that, you know, we use the word diversity now, but it wasn't the language that they would have used then. They said that media needed to be integrated. You know, that looking at the monochromatically white population of American media was one of the reasons that reporting on these incidents tended to inflame tensions even more. And so, you know, they made these specific recommendations among a raft of recommendations. You know, one of the things I say in the introduction is that the Kerner Commission was so meticulous and so broad in its recommendations that it almost doomed itself by simply saying that there were too many things to be done. And the other portion of it, though, was that they came to these conclusions by interviewing policymakers, doing fact-finding, you know, missions, looking at the relevant scholarship, you know, that was available, that had talked about these issues, and so on. And so they really did kind of have an exhaustive survey, you know, of the landscape. And, you know, in some cases, the reporting that was, you know, done, you know, by themselves, the commission members themselves, reporting back on, you know, what they saw in these cities, really did make it directly into the reports. When I spoke with Senator Harris, you know, whose recall is astounding, we talked for about 3 hours about his experience, and he said that he remembered talking with a group of young men in Cincinnati in 1967, and, you know, he said, "What is it that's needed to help here?" And they said, "Jobs, baby," you know, which is how I knew this really was what somebody said in 1967, because, you know, you would preface or conclude, you know, baby was the universal suffix, you know, for any sentence, the relevant suffix. But you know, that was how they went about finding the information that was later codified in the report.
So it was interesting. One of the things that you mentioned was the scholarship that they sort of surveyed as a part of pulling this report together. There was a question from the audience about Senator Daniel Moynihan's report on Two Americas, and wondered whether that was, how did that relate to the Kerner Commission?
So the language that the Kerner Commission report used, you know, famously, when people distill it down to, there's any one sentence that people know from the Kerner report, it's that we are on the verge of creating two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. But that language was actually hashed out in the commission itself, where people were going back and forth and, you know, debating what they wanted to say in the preface, and, you know, every line had to be you know, agreed upon by, you know, majority in the room, and so that wasn't, you know, influenced by anyone else outside of that. But where Daniel Moynihan's influence is felt and seen very vividly is in the examinations of the Black family, because they talk about, there's a whole section about Black families in the context of, you know, the urban landscape, or what they would have called ghetto at that time, you know, Black families in the ghettos. And it almost kind of lifted from Moynihan's 1965 report on the state of the Black family. And, you know, that also winds up being one of the portions of the report that is least relevant now, because, you know, subsequent scholarship has really taken significant issue with Moynihan's report on the Black family. But yes, that's where that comes from. The other thing that I think was maybe a spiritual guide, so to speak, was American Dilemma, you know, which is the 2-volume gigantic sociological report on the so-called Negro question that was released just after World War II. and really set the agenda of Cold War liberalism as it related to race. And Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish sociologist who oversaw the production of American Dilemma, which was a Carnegie Foundation project. That really, I think, was the template for how you wound up with a 700-page government report that was almost exactly 20 years later directed at the same sort of questions.
So a couple of the audience members have been asking some questions around education policy and how the funding of education in a state like West Virginia, it's tied to property taxes and levies that are issued. And did the Kerner Commission address that as a part of its review of education, and what recommendations did they make? How does that legacy continue to play out on inequality in education?
Yeah, I mean, I don't recall the commission addressing the property tax issue specifically, but they do address the disparity in educational funding. As a kind of, they look institutionally at each kind of front of racial discrimination and the disparities that are implicit within it. And so one of the things that they call for is an overhaul of urban education, and saying that education needs to be funded at a massively higher level than it currently is. But it's possible in the original text they talk about the property tax issue, but not anything that comes up in my recollection. Now, one of the other things I think is significant about the Kerner report is that they believe that the source of American prosperity has by and large been government facilitating policy and practices that contribute to the well-being, or at least opportunity, for American citizens. And so they believe that the problem in the ghetto, so to speak, is that those things have never really been applied there. And even that is a kind of dated idea to us now. We have a sense that government is the problem, as Ronald Reagan said, and it's the reason, if anything, government gets in the way of the creation of prosperity. And so when the Kerner Commission makes this report, it literally comes out months ahead of the government turning in the complete opposite direction, as embodied by the candidacy of Richard Nixon. And so, that's kind of, the last gasp of American liberalism, in education policy or any other policy, is of 1960s form of American liberalism, at least.
Well, that kind of feeds right into another question we had, which was in the monumental year of 1968 and in the sort of succeeding years, how you mentioned sort of the official government response to the Kerner Commission report, and then the popular response to it. How did people like Richard Nixon or Hubert Humphrey or McCarthy or some of the other big political figures in this time period, did any of them take it up? Did they outright ignore it or reject it? How did it play out in that dialogue?
Yeah, there's some political rhetoric from Nixon around Kerner. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but he basically took aim at Kerner and saying that this was, exactly the kinds of problems, the thing that, and of course, the idea that the problems in the ghetto were the product of white racism was just great political fodder for him, particularly as he was arguing that the problem was the absence of law and order. And so Fred Harris said that one moment where he knew that the political tides were against him was when he spoke to his own father, who was a farmer and been a farmer his whole life. And his father talked about saying, "Are you telling me that I'm responsible for what these people are doing in these ghettos in the city?" And he just knew that a lot of people were going to view the question, to view the report in that way. And that even had an impact on his own political outlook in ways we can kind of talk about down the line. But yeah, so it was almost a gift to Nixon. And he did make reference to it. I don't know if McCarthy or Humphrey ever made any reference to it.
So it's a really interesting question that showed up, talking a little bit about language. And I think if one of the things that came out of the last year and the tragedies that we witnessed and which sort of ignited a renewed movement in this is seeing how potent language is, how we talk about victimhood, how we talk about oppression, how we talk about those things. Did the Kerner Commission deal with sort of commonly held language or sort of cultural language that maybe is tied with white supremacy or tied with some of these longer historical things that continue to play out in how we interact?
No, it really didn't. Not in terms of language.
Mm-hmm.
But that question does remind me of one of the things I should have pointed out, which is that this commission had 11 members, 9 of them were white. And one of the Black members, Senator Edward Brooke, was really not very involved. And so this was the vision of a number of white people, who were observing the question or trying to execute the charge that President Johnson had placed in their hands. And so they look on a lot of fronts, but you don't really see a linguistic one.
So another member of the audience asked about, they said the book, The Color of Law, details how federal, state, and local governments segregate housing by public policy, and talks about unequal and generational unequal wealth distribution in the United States. Did the Kerner Commission take up the idea of what today I think popularly is sort of talked about as reparations, or the idea of this sort of passing up or exchanging of some of that generational wealth that was forfeited through policy?
So no, they don't, but not in the sense that we think of reparations now, but they do discuss as a kind of reparative approach via policy. And so it says, policy has unfairly disadvantaged these people. We need different policy that will eliminate the disadvantage. And we also need to proactively invest in ways that will undo the impact of previous policies. And in a way that people might be able to construe as reparations maybe, but they don't kind of talk about it in that discrete sense. I think that the reparations conversation is its own thing. And they're much more interested in that. But to the point about Richard Rothstein, they absolutely grapple with the housing and the discrimination, of even then people being aware of redlining and discrimination in lending and those kinds of things that created the ghetto, so to speak, as we understand it. And one of the things that they, really, I think, have to be credited with is their willingness to follow the roots of these questions, beyond just, what appears to be obvious. And so that section on housing is, very detailed and very involved. And, it led to them saying that there needed to be, 6 million units of affordable housing created in the United States, even to approach parity. One other thing that is important is that we have a kind of popular perception that the riots of the 1960s sparked white flight. And oops, I've lost my light here. Well, we'll just keep going. I think you can see me well enough.
Yeah.
We have a narrative that the riots of the 1960s created white flight, and the problems in the 1970s were a result of that. But that's actually not true, and it kind of inverts what happens. When you go back to these cities, Detroit, Newark, Baltimore, DC, Chicago, Detroit, their white populations started declining in the 1940s. Immediately after World War II, as the American housing market essentially gets created, and its discriminatory practices become entrenched, and we begin to see the impact of it, the white populations of these cities decrease, the Black populations stay the same or increase. And so between 1940 and 1950 census, which is something I've actually done, and you go back and look at these cities and the white population gets smaller. And then the white population gets smaller again between 1950 and 1960. And then by the time you get to 1965, when this spate of uprisings and civil disturbances and riots and whatever language you want to use for it begin happening, we're looking at a 20-year-old process. That the cities have been depleted and are relying upon their lowest income earners, their lowest wage earners for their tax base. And that's why you see things like Cincinnati with the garbage not even being picked up. And so it's a reaction, what happens in these years is a reaction to white flight, as opposed to it being the instigating incident of white flight.
One of our audience members asked, has the press come anywhere close to achieving the integration, as they would say, or the diversity that they called for in the Kerner Commission report?
No. The press kind of media cyclically will kind of revisit these questions. There have been two cycles of this in recent years, somewhat recent years. The first was after Barack Obama was elected. You start seeing more Black people show up in media roles as reporters, as commentators, as various kinds of participants in the roundtables, et cetera. I kind of jokingly said that one day I turned on CNN and thought I was watching BET after Barack Obama was elected in 2008. And quite frankly, I think the media was shamed into being aggressively interested in diversity when there are many instances more Black people living in the White House than working for your outlet. And so that was one. And then the second was after George Floyd, where people again kind of revisited that question. But we still have kind of woefully underrepresented groups, for African Americans, for Latinos, for Asian Americans, certainly for Native Americans. The groups that have traditionally been excluded continue to be underrepresented in the American media landscape.
So there have been lots of questions come in, kind of commenting on, I think roughly around the sort of a theme of what does the format or the I guess the system of a government commission and a government study like the Kerner Commission Report, how does that format or that system, in your opinion, does it enable some sort of enhanced ability to study and draw conclusions as opposed to other ways of exploring these issues? What did the fact that the Kerner Commission was produced by the government as a federal government project mean in its findings and perhaps in its impact?
So, I mean, it had the weight of authority, because the other thing is that most of the people who were on this commission did not start out where they ended. And so they followed the facts, and the facts led them to this place that was an indictment of American racism. And so I've never really felt comfortable with the way that we dismiss commissions. Because commissions are in many instances as kind of political play acting or theater, but there are very many other important things that are done by commissions. The FDA has commissions that evaluate the safety of various drugs and so on. It's really the circumstances under which the commission is created and the real intention of the people who are appointing the commission. And so for whatever reasons, Lyndon B. Johnson took a comparatively hands-off approach to the commission until the kind of train had left the station and it was heading this direction that it was pretty difficult to stop. And so I think that commissions can work and they can do important things. And in the introduction to this book, I talk about the commission, the Kerner Commission, existing in concert with with two other government reports that the public is generally aware of. The Warren Report, which of course looks into the circumstances surrounding the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and the 9/11 Report, which looks into the dynamics that led to the largest terrorist attack in American history on American soil. If you talk to people about government reports, it's probably those three that people will have some awareness of. I don't know, we'll see what comes out of the January 6th commission, who knows. But I don't think that we can overlook the importance of what it achieved as one of those commissions.
So that actually kind of lends itself perfectly to another question that I've seen pop up a couple times, which is what action did follow the releasing of the Kerner Commission report in a policy sense? Did it comes out at a time when Congress was probably in one of its most productive periods in the history of our country, and able to pass a remarkable amount of policy and legislation in a relatively short period of time. So were there direct policies that came out of the findings of the Kerner Commission report that were implemented in the immediate or since its release?
Not really. You don't see, certainly not in that early period. Eventually you start seeing some ideas from Kerner that bubble up, again. And so one of the things that was most notable, which was last summer, the rise of public discussion of the phrase defund the police, which is a terrible slogan for political reasons. But when you go back to the Kerner report, they say in 1968 that many of the communities we're talking about just flat out have too much contact with police, that police are called to address every single problem, and they're problems that law enforcement is not equipped to deal with and are not the best people to address this particular concern. And so there should be the creation of alternate bureaucracies and alternate social service institutions that can address problems where police are not the best fit. That's essentially what the inflammatory slogan "Defund the Police" was asking for. That hasn't happened. In some instances, in some small scales, you're seeing that. Interestingly enough, Newark is one of the cities is trying these pilot programs, but you haven't seen a lot of those things incorporated, not on a large scale.
So there was a question about reactions to the Kerner Commission report. And were there any organizations or groups that attempted to either refute or directly question the authenticity of the findings of the Kerner Commission?
Oh, sure. There have been a number of kind of rejoinders to the Kerner report. I believe the Heritage Foundation published one or two of them. And for people on the political right, Kerner has been a target of everything, because they literally are saying there needs to be more liberalism, and that the problem in American cities is the absence of inclusion, the very kinds of programs that conservatives were saying were wasteful and didn't work in the first place. And so, so there's that. I want to say that Abigail or Stephen Thernstrom wrote a critique of Kerner. And there have been other people that critiqued Kerner from the left. The sociologist Matthew Huey, wrote a report essentially saying that Kerner didn't go far enough in its recommendations. And so by no means is there universal acclaim for the Kerner Commission and the work that it did.
Well, I'm going to do my best to sort of compile what I think is a good question to kind of transition maybe into a reading. But there's been a lot of questions talking about sort of the idea of could something like this happen today in response to, the in many ways the continuation or maybe even the worsening of some of the divides between white and Black America. And so sort of some questions that deal with, like, do you think that it's even possible that such a commission could form in today's just in sort of the state of today's American politic? But also then lots of questions about what should we look to the Kerner Commission report for in terms of advice for dealing with our current state of affairs in the United States today.
I think that it would be very difficult for something like this to happen now. And I'll give two examples of why. The first is that during the Obama administration, the Department of Homeland Security noted an alarming growth in militant white nationalist organizations. And Republicans on the Hill lost it and demanded that that language be retracted. And a very kind of bland version of that report was produced. We couldn't even say that white racism was a problem when we're talking about people who were dangerous and willing to commit violence. And so that's one. The other is the current debate about critical race theory, or what we're calling critical race theory. What people are actually debating is not what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is a very highly specific set of critiques around jurisprudence and discrimination law. But it's become a catch-all for all these other kinds of conversations that people are having. But even then, we can't have an honest reckoning with the role of race and racism in American life. And so I think it would be very hard for something like that to happen. And secondly, I think that when we looked at George Floyd as a person who was unemployed, a person who had suffered from COVID and had recovered, and the community he was in, or the community in North Minneapolis, which has a staggering disparity in life opportunities between that and the white enclaves of Minneapolis, that it's strikingly apparent that the concerns we see are not simply about policing, and that we will never have a time where we have great policing, but we have terribly unequal education, terribly unequal healthcare, terribly unequal housing, and all these other kinds of things. I think these things are, in concert, of a kind.
Well, I think maybe one more question that I've seen pop up in a couple of ways is, would also be maybe a fitting way to kind of transition. And that is, in your opinion, in light of all of the research and the work that you've done with the Kerner Commission report specifically, but just in general in your research in your field, do you see things that we have progressed on that the Kerner Commission identified as problems, or do you think that, sort of what is the legacy for us to look at today of this commission as it's being republished now for a new generation of people to become familiar with?
Interesting. I think that actually can best be answered by reading. And so the part that I was going to read. And so I'll read a little bit from the beginning, and then I'll read the last paragraph. The findings of the Kerner Commission report exist alongside those of the Warren and 9/11 commissions among the handful of governmental reports whose historic import has outlived the moment in which they were issued. The Warren Report, intended to be the last word on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, has been anything but, launching more inquiry and debate, not to mention conspiracy theories, more conspiracy theories in the wake than existed prior to its publication. The 9/11 Commission Report, issued in the summer of 2004, traced the origins of terrorist attacks that destroyed the World Trade Center and which killed 2,753 people 3 years earlier. In so doing, it became an essential guide to understanding an ongoing era of American politics that is defined by and continues to operate in response to the events of that indelible September morning. The Kerner Commission Report, however, is different. The Warren and 9/11 reports are concerned with singular events, tragedies that remained unique in either scale or kind since they were examined. They function as primary sources in history. The Kerner Commission, more formally known as the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, details an extant problem, one that is defined by its redundancy. This was apparent even at the outset of the Commission's existence. When President Lyndon B. Johnson created the Commission in July of 1967, it was tasked with understanding what had happened up to that moment. Nearly 24 uprisings, or in the antiseptic language of the report, civil disorders, had occurred between 1964 and 1967, with the largest and most destructive taking place in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles over the course of 5 days in August 1965. The Commission could not have known when it released its findings in March 1968 that it was issuing a preface, not a postscript. Martin Luther King was assassinated the following month, and more than 100 American cities exploded into just the type of violence that the Kerner Commission had sought to understand, if not prevent. The proximity of the two events, the report's release and Martin Luther King's death, allowed for people to, over time, conflate them. It was not uncommon to believe that the Kerner Commission report examined the unrest of the entire 60s, rather than just the first installment of them. But the timing is important, if only because the Kerner report was fated from the moment it reached shelves to operate crucially as a forecast than a review. We hear George Santayana's dictum that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it, quoted with eye-rolling frequency. But Kerner establishes that it is possible for us to be entirely cognizant of history and repeat it anyway. Never was this more apparent than in the spring of 2020, when the half-century-old report reemerged as part of the stilted national dialogue on race, policing, and inequality. And I'll jump from there to the last paragraph, which says, "Such has been the significance of this report that the offhand mention of Kerner is far more likely to be a reference to the study than to the late politician himself. This revised version of the report is offered in recognition of its continued value and import. But there's a conflict of interest at the heart of this endeavor. The book is published with the particular hope in mind that its renewed availability might result in its observations being more thoroughly heeded. A toxin that Americans then chose to ignore. Its warnings remain strikingly relevant. Our hope is that this book may hasten the day when they no longer are."
Well, I want to first of all thank you so much, Professor Jelani Cobb, for sharing with us your remarkable research and work on this historic and really important report that we all need to, I think, be much more familiar with. And anyone can inspire us to do it. I think you have done it tonight.
Thank you.
So I do believe that if you haven't gotten a copy yet, you can still procure one through Four Seasons Books right here in Shepherdstown.
Yes, please do.
Yes, and I want to thank everyone in the audience tonight for your tremendous questions, and some that I hope you all will grab a copy of the Essential Kerner Commission Report to seek out some of the answers that we didn't get to. But with that, I want to again say thank you so much for your time this evening, for joining us and giving us this incredible presentation, Professor. Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good night.
And I want to invite everyone to our upcoming program in about 2 weeks' time. We will be hosting another virtual book talk featuring author Andrew Aden and looking at his work on a number of works, including most recently the March trilogy featuring the late Congressman John Lewis. And that event is on Wednesday, November 10th at 7 p.m. here on Zoom. You can visit byrdcenter.org to sign up for that event. And we hope to see you on Zoom then. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.